The first shot that started the feud between the Thornton and Hayes families rang out on a scorching July afternoon in 1878, killing a man over a disputed water source in Presidio, Texas. And by the time Jackson Thornton rode into town 5 years later in the summer of 1883, 6 men lay buried in the sun-baked earth because of the hatred between the two ranching families. Jackson was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and weathered from years of working cattle under the relentless Texas sun. His father had been the third man to die in the feud, shot down outside the general store 3 years earlier by Marcus Hayes himself. The memory of finding his father bleeding in the dust still haunted Jackson's dreams, but he carried the weight of the Thornton ranch on his shoulders now. And with that responsibility came the burden of keeping his younger brothers safe while the violence continued to spiral. The heat shimmered off the dusty main street of Presidio as Jackson dismounted outside the saloon. The town sat along the Rio Grande, a strategic location that had made both the Thornton and Hayes ranches prosperous, but that prosperity had come at a terrible cost. The disputed water rights that had sparked the original conflict had expanded into a blood vendetta that consumed everything in its path. Inside the saloon, Jackson found his foreman, Tom Whitaker, nursing a whiskey at a corner table. The older man looked up with weary eyes that had seen too much death. "Any trouble today?" Jackson asked, sliding into the chair across from him. "Hayes's men were spotted near the northern boundary again," Tom replied, his voice low. "No shots fired, but the tension is thick enough to cut with a knife." Jackson removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. "This has to end, Tom. We have lost too much already. My father, my uncle, 4 good men who worked for us. How many more graves do we need to dig before someone has the sense to stop this madness?" "Pride is a powerful thing," Tom said. "And Marcus Hayes has plenty of it. He blames your family for his son's death, just like you blame his family for your father's." "His son drew first," Jackson said, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt the hollowness of the justification. Robert Hayes had been 19 years old, barely more than a boy, when he had died in a shootout with Jackson's uncle. The cycle of revenge had continued ever since. "Maybe so," Tom agreed, "but that does not bring the dead back, and it will not stop the killing unless someone breaks the cycle." Jackson drained the whiskey Tom pushed across the table to him, feeling the burn slide down his throat. "What would you suggest?" "I cannot simply surrender our water rights. The ranch would not survive a single summer without access to the river." "I am not suggesting surrender," Tom said carefully, "but there might be another way, a way that does not involve more bloodshed." Before Jackson could press him for details, the saloon doors swung open and a hush fell over the room. Jackson turned to see Marcus Hayes standing in the doorway, his weathered face set in hard lines. The older man was in his early 50s, still powerful despite the silver threading through his dark hair. 2 of his ranch hands flanked him, their hands resting near their holsters. Every man in the saloon tensed, waiting to see if more blood would be spilled on the sawdust-covered floor. Jackson's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Tom's weathered hand clamped down on his wrist. "Not here," Tom hissed. "Not like this." Marcus Hayes's cold blue eyes swept the room until they locked on Jackson. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the crowded saloon, the weight of 6 deaths hanging between them. Then, surprisingly, Marcus gave a curt nod and moved to the bar, deliberately turning his back on Jackson. It was not quite a gesture of peace, but it was not an invitation to violence either. Jackson slowly relaxed his gun hand and stood. "I need some air," he muttered to Tom and pushed through the doors back into the blistering heat of the afternoon. The town of Presidio was small, barely more than a main street with a handful of buildings clustered along it. The Rio Grande flowed sluggishly in the summer heat, its waters precious and increasingly scarce as the dry season wore on. Jackson understood why the conflict had started, even if he hated where it had led. Water meant life in this harsh land, and both families needed it to survive. He was walking toward the general store when he saw her. She stood outside the dress shop, a parasol shading her face from the brutal sun, but even in shadow, Jackson could see she was beautiful. She wore a simple but well-made dress of pale blue cotton, and her dark hair was pinned up in a style that suggested refinement unusual for Presidio. She was examining a display of fabric in the window, her profile delicate and thoughtful. Jackson found himself slowing, then stopping altogether, simply watching her. There was something graceful about the way she moved, a natural elegance that seemed out of place in the rough frontier town. He wondered if she was passing through, perhaps the daughter of a merchant or a visiting relative. Then she turned, and their eyes met. Hers were green, he noticed, a startling shade like new grass after a spring rain. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, they simply looked at each other. Jackson felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced before, like recognition of something he had been searching for without knowing he was looking. She smiled, a small, tentative expression that transformed her face, and Jackson felt his breath catch. He took a step toward her, drawn by an impulse he did not fully understand. "Excuse me, miss," he began, reaching up to tip his hat politely. "I do not believe I have seen you in Presidio before. Are you new to town?" The smile faded from her face as her gaze traveled over him, taking in his dusty clothes, the gun at his hip, and something in his bearing that seemed to give him away. Her expression shifted to something cooler, more guarded. "I have been away," she said, her voice soft but with an underlying strength. "At school in San Antonio, but I am home now." "Home," Jackson repeated, confused, "but I thought I knew most of the families in Presidio." "Perhaps you do not know them as well as you think," she replied, and there was an edge to her words now. "Or perhaps you have been too occupied with your family's feuding to notice anything else." The words hit Jackson like cold water. "I am sorry, but you have me at a disadvantage. You seem to know who I am, but I do not know you." "I am Eleanor Hayes," she said, and watched his face carefully as the name registered. "Marcus Hayes is my father." Jackson felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. This beautiful woman who had smiled at him just moments ago was the daughter of his family's greatest enemy, the man who had killed his father, the man Jackson had sworn to make pay for that death. "I see," he managed, his voice rough. "Then I apologize for disturbing you, Miss Hayes." He turned to walk away, but her voice stopped him. "Wait." Jackson looked back, surprised. Eleanor had taken a step toward him, her expression conflicted. "You are Jackson Thornton," she said. It was not a question. "I have heard my father speak of you. He says you are stubborn and proud, just like your father was." "And what has your father told you about how my father died?" Jackson asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "He says it was self-defense," Eleanor replied quietly. "He says your father drew first during an argument about the river access." "That is a lie," Jackson said flatly. "My father was shot in the back." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "That is not what I was told." "I imagine there are many things you have not been told, Miss Hayes. Just as I am sure my family has kept things from me. That is the nature of feuds. Everyone believes they are in the right, and the truth gets lost in the blood." She studied him for a long moment, and Jackson had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing past his anger to something deeper. You do not want this fight any more than I want my brothers to die in it, do you?" Jackson was taken aback by her directness. "I want justice for my father, and after you have your justice, will that bring him back? Will it make the pain go away?" Eleanor's voice was gentle, but her words cut deep. "My mother died 5 years ago before this feud truly began. Sometimes I am grateful she did not live to see what has become of our families. She would have been heartbroken. 6 men are dead," Jackson said. 6 men who had families, who had lives ahead of them. That blood cries out for something. It cannot simply be forgotten. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but perhaps it does not have to be answered with more blood." Before Jackson could respond, the door of the dress shop opened and a middle-aged woman appeared, her face creased with worry. "Miss Eleanor, you should not be speaking with him. If your father sees you talking to a Thornton, there will be trouble." Eleanor glanced at the woman, who was clearly some kind of companion or chaperone, then back at Jackson. "Perhaps you are right, Mrs. Cooper. Good day, Mr. Thornton." She turned and walked away, her skirts swishing in the dust, and Jackson watched her go with a confusion of emotions churning in his chest. Anger at who she was, the daughter of the man who had killed his father. But also something else, something that had sparked in that first moment when their eyes met, before names and history had complicated everything. That evening, Jackson returned to the Thornton Ranch, a sprawling property that stretched along the northern banks of the Rio Grande. The ranch house was built of adobe and wood, practical and sturdy rather than elegant, designed to withstand the harsh Texas weather. His 2 younger brothers, David and Samuel, were working with the hands to bring in the horses for the night when he arrived. "How was town?" David asked. He was 23, tall and lean like Jackson, but with an easier smile that Jackson envied. "Complicated," Jackson replied, dismounting and handing his reins to one of the stable hands. "I ran into Marcus Hayes at the saloon, and I met his daughter." Both brothers stopped what they were doing. Samuel, the youngest at 20, looked alarmed. "Hayes was there. Was there trouble?" "No trouble," Jackson said, "which is strange in itself. He could have started something, but he did not." "And his daughter?" David pressed. "I did not know Hayes had a daughter." "She has been away at school, apparently. She just returned." Jackson hesitated, unsure how to explain the encounter. "Her name is Eleanor. She spoke to me about the feud." "What did she say?" Samuel asked, his hand drifting toward the gun at his hip, as though even the mention of a Hayes required defensive preparation. "She suggested that more killing would not solve anything," Jackson said. "That we need to find another way to end this." David and Samuel exchanged glances. "Easy for her to say," Samuel muttered. "Her father is not the one who was gunned down." "Neither is yours," Jackson reminded him sharply. "Our father is dead, Samuel. Nothing we do will change that, but we have to decide what kind of men we want to be. Do we want to keep killing until there is no one left, or do we want to find a way forward?" "Since when do you talk like this?" David asked, studying his older brother with concern. "Just last week you were ready to ride onto Hayes' property and settle this once and for all." "I know," Jackson admitted. "But I am tired, David. I am tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of wondering which of you will be the next one I have to bury. There has to be a better way." That night, Jackson lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His mind kept returning to Eleanor Hayes, to her green eyes and the way she had looked at him with both understanding and challenge. She had seen through his anger to the exhaustion beneath it, had recognized in him the same weariness she must feel about the violence consuming their families. He found himself wondering about her, about what it had been like to grow up as the daughter of Marcus Hayes, to be sent away to school while men died over a strip of land and water rights. Had she wanted to leave, Or had it been her father's decision to keep her safe from the violence? And why had she come back now, when the feud was still burning hot? The next morning, Jackson rode into Presidio again, telling himself he needed to speak with the sheriff about boundary disputes, but knowing in his heart that he was hoping to see Eleanor again. He was not disappointed. She was walking along the boardwalk with her chaperone, the older woman Mrs. Cooper trailing a few steps behind, laden with parcels from the general store. Eleanor saw him immediately, and Jackson saw a flash of something in her expression. There, and gone too quickly to identify. She paused, clearly debating whether to acknowledge him, then gave a small nod. Jackson dismounted and approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Miss Hayes, good morning. Mr. Thornton." Her voice was formal, but he caught a hint of warmth beneath the propriety. "I trust you had a pleasant evening." "Restless," Jackson admitted. "I found myself thinking about what you said yesterday, about finding another way." Mrs. Cooper cleared her throat disapprovingly, but Eleanor ignored her. "And what conclusions did you reach?" "That I do not have any answers," Jackson said honestly. "But that I would like to find some. If you would be willing to speak with me again, perhaps we could discuss possibilities." "Miss Eleanor, this is not proper," Mrs. Cooper protested. "Your father would be very displeased." "My father is not here," Eleanor said mildly. "And Mr. Thornton is suggesting a conversation, not an elopement, Mrs. Cooper." Despite the tension, Jackson found himself fighting a smile at her tartness. "I would be entirely proper, I assure you, madam. Perhaps Miss Hayes would consider meeting me this afternoon at the church. Surely even the most concerned father could not object to a meeting on consecrated ground with the reverend nearby." Eleanor considered this. 2:00, she finally said, "but Mrs. Cooper must accompany me." "Of course," Jackson agreed. "I would not suggest otherwise." The Mexican Catholic Church in Presidio was a small adobe building with a wooden cross above the door and a surprisingly cool interior that offered blessed relief from the heat. Jackson arrived early and found the young priest, Father Miguel, tending to the altar candles. "Jackson Thornton," the priest said warmly, "it has been too long since I have seen you at Mass." "I know, Father, I apologize. The ranch keeps me occupied." Jackson hesitated. "I am meeting someone here this afternoon. Miss Eleanor Hayes. We are going to talk about the feud between our families." Father Miguel's expression grew serious. "That is a dangerous conversation, my son, but perhaps a necessary one. Too much blood has been spilled already. The Lord teaches us forgiveness and reconciliation, though I know these are difficult paths to walk. I do not know if I can forgive Marcus Hayes for killing my father," Jackson admitted, "but I think I need to try to find a way to stop more killing, not just for my sake, but for my brothers. They deserve a chance at a life that is not consumed by violence." "That is wise," Father Miguel said. "And Miss Hayes, what do you know of her?" "Almost nothing," Jackson said. "Only that she was away at school and has recently returned. And that when she looks at me, I feel as though she sees who I am beneath the anger and the grief." The priest smiled slightly. "Be careful, Jackson. The heart is a powerful force, and it does not always respect the boundaries we try to set for it." At 2:00, Eleanor arrived with Mrs. Cooper. She wore a different dress today, a simple green cotton that matched her eyes. Her dark hair was partially covered by a bonnet, but loose tendrils framed her face. Jackson felt that same strange tightening in his chest when he saw her. They settled on a bench in the small courtyard behind the church, shaded by a scraggly cottonwood tree. Mrs. Cooper sat on another bench 20 feet away, close enough to observe propriety but far enough to give them some privacy for their conversation. "Thank you for coming," Jackson said. "I was not sure you would." "I was not sure I would either," Eleanor admitted. "My father would be furious if he knew, but I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realized I wanted to hear more of your perspective." "My perspective is that 6 men are dead for no good reason," Jackson said, "and that if we continue down this path, more will die. Perhaps my brothers, perhaps your father, perhaps me. And for what? Water rights that we could share if both sides were willing to compromise." "It has gone beyond water rights now," Eleanor said quietly. "You know that as well as I do. It is about pride and revenge. My father believes your family dishonored him when your uncle killed my brother Robert. He will not rest until that death is answered." Jackson felt a chill despite the heat. "Your brother. I did not realize you had lost someone in the feud as well." "He was 17, Eleanor said, and her voice caught slightly. "Just a boy, really, though he thought himself a man. He went out with my father one day to confront your uncle about cattle that had supposedly crossed onto our land. There was a disagreement, and Robert pulled his gun. Your uncle was faster." "I am sorry," Jackson said, and meant it. "That must have been terrible for you." "It was," Eleanor said simply. "That is when my father sent me to San Antonio to keep me safe and away from the violence. I was 16. I have been gone for 4 years, getting an education and trying not to think about what was happening back home. But I am 20 now, and I could not stay away any longer. This is my home and my family, no matter how complicated things have become." "Do you have other siblings?" Jackson asked. "2 older brothers, Thomas and William. They both work the ranch with my father. Both of them have become harder since Robert died, more willing to fight. I fear for them constantly." She looked at Jackson directly. "Just as I imagine you fear for your brothers." "Every day," Jackson admitted. "Samuel is hot-headed and wants to prove himself. David is more level-headed, but even he has grown bitter. This feud is poisoning everything, turning us all into people we should not be." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "There is an old tradition, you know. In medieval times, when 2 families or kingdoms were at war, they would sometimes arrange a marriage between the houses to bring peace." Jackson looked at her sharply, his pulse quickening. "Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting?" "I am not suggesting anything," Eleanor said quickly, though a faint blush colored her cheeks. "I am merely noting that such things have been done before in times of conflict, though I suppose circumstances would have to be very specific for such an arrangement to work." "It would require both families to agree," Jackson said slowly, his mind racing. "And both parties to the marriage would have to be willing." "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "It would require a great deal of courage and faith, and it would undoubtedly be difficult, at least at first." Jackson found himself studying her face, seeing not just her beauty but her intelligence and strength. "If such an arrangement were to be made, what do you think the terms would need to be?" "A genuine commitment to peace," Eleanor said immediately. "Not just a cessation of violence, but real cooperation. Shared water rights, perhaps even combined herds in some areas. The creation of something new from the ashes of the old conflict." "That would mean trusting each other," Jackson said, "after all that has happened." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "It would require trust and time. But the alternative is more death, more grieving families, more hatred passed down to the next generation. Is that really what either of us wants for our future?" Jackson thought about his brothers, about the men who worked for him, about the life he had envisioned before his father's death had consumed everything. "No," he said finally, "that is not what I want." Eleanor met his gaze, and in her green eyes, Jackson saw both determination and vulnerability. "Then perhaps we should consider alternative paths, Mr. Thornton." "Jackson," he said, "if we are going to discuss ending a blood feud, I think we can dispense with formality." A small smile tugged at her lips. Jackson, and you may call me Eleanor, though not in front of my father. At least, not yet. They talked for another hour, discussing the specifics of what a peace agreement might look like, carefully dancing around the personal implications of what they were truly discussing. By the time Eleanor rose to leave, Jackson felt as though he had known her far longer than 2 brief meetings. There was an ease to their conversation that surprised him, a natural connection that transcended the circumstances that should have made them enemies. "Will you meet me again?" Jackson asked as she prepared to depart with Mrs. Cooper. Eleanor hesitated. "I should not. The risk of my father discovering these meetings grows with each one. But will you?" She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, tomorrow, same time, same place." "But Jackson, we need to move carefully. If my father suspects I am meeting with you, or if your family learns of it, the consequences could be severe." "I understand," Jackson said. "And Eleanor, thank you for being willing to talk, for seeing past the hatred to what might be possible." "Thank you for listening," she replied. "Not many men would be willing to consider an alternative to violence. It speaks well of you." Over the following weeks, Jackson and Eleanor met regularly at the church, always with Mrs. Cooper present, but increasingly lost in conversations that ranged far beyond the practical details of peace negotiations. Jackson learned that Eleanor loved to read, that she had been educated by nuns in San Antonio, who had taught her not just academics but philosophy and ethics. She dreamed of a world where conflicts could be resolved through dialogue rather than gunfire, where families could prosper together rather than tearing each other apart. Eleanor learned that Jackson had not always wanted to be a rancher, that he had once harbored dreams of becoming a teacher before his father's death had forced him to take over the family business. He spoke of his love for the land, for the harsh beauty of the desert and the way the Rio Grande looked at sunset. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was young, and how much he still missed her gentle wisdom. But they also spent hours discussing the practical realities of bringing their families together. Jackson consulted with Tom, his foreman, about the possibility of sharing water access and grazing lands. Tom was skeptical but willing to consider it if it meant an end to the violence. Eleanor carefully probed her father's mood, trying to gauge whether he might be receptive to a peace overture. "He is tired," she told Jackson during one of their meetings in late August. "More tired than he wants to admit. The feud has aged him. But he is also proud, and he will not be seen as weak or as surrendering." "What if the proposal came from him?" Jackson suggested. "What if we found a way to make him believe it was his idea?" Eleanor considered this. "That might work, but how would we accomplish it?" "Leave that to me," Jackson said. "But Eleanor, there is something I need to know before we go any further with this plan." "What is it?" Jackson took a deep breath, knowing he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "If I were to propose a marriage between us as part of a peace settlement, how would you respond?" Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment she did not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you asking hypothetically, or are you truly asking?" "I am asking what your heart tells you," Jackson said. "Because mine is telling me that what began as a practical solution has become something more. When I am with you, Eleanor, I forget about the feud and the hatred. I forget about everything except how right it feels to be near you." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I feel the same way. But Jackson, this is not a simple matter. A marriage between us would not be based on courtship and romance, at least not in the beginning. It would be a political arrangement, a tool for peace. Can we build something real from such a foundation?" "I think we already have," Jackson said gently. "These weeks of talking, of learning about each other, of planning for a better future together, That is more than many couples have when they marry. And Eleanor, I can promise you this. I will spend every day of our life together trying to make you happy, trying to earn the gift of your trust and your heart. A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek. This is madness. My father may refuse. Your brothers may object. Everyone will say we are foolish to think we can bridge the gap between our families. Then let them say it, Jackson said. I would rather be a fool who tried to make peace than a wise man who watched more people die. What do you say, Eleanor? Will you take this risk with me? She looked at him for a long moment, and Jackson saw the war of emotions in her expression. Fear, hope, uncertainty, and something else, something that made his heart race. Finally, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers trembling slightly in his. Yes, she said. I will take this risk with you. But we must be smart about how we approach our families. This cannot look like a secret romance or an elopement. It must be presented as a serious proposal for peace, with the marriage as the seal of the agreement. Agreed, Jackson said, gently squeezing her hand. I will speak with the sheriff and Father Miguel, get them on our side as mediators. They are both respected by the community and might be able to help convince our families that this is the right path. And I will work on my father, Eleanor said. Try to soften him to the idea of negotiations. But Jackson, you must promise me something, anything. Promise me that whatever happens, we will not let this tear us apart. If our families refuse, if the plan fails, promise me you will not disappear from my life. Jackson lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that made Mrs. Cooper cough pointedly from her bench. I promise, he said. You are not getting rid of me that easily, Eleanor Hayes. She smiled through her tears. Then we have a plan. God help us both. The next week, Jackson met with Sheriff Tom Brennan, a grizzled veteran of the Texas Rangers who had been trying unsuccessfully to keep peace between the Thornton and Hayes families for years. The sheriff listened to Jackson's proposal with growing surprise. A marriage, Brennan repeated. Between you and Marcus Hayes's daughter, that is either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I have heard in 20 years of law enforcement. Maybe both, Jackson admitted. But it could work, Sheriff. It could finally end this madness. Marcus Hayes is a proud man, Brennan warned. He might see this as an attempt to steal his daughter rather than an olive branch. That is why I need you and Father Miguel to help present it properly. This has to be framed as a serious peace proposal, not a romantic entanglement. The marriage would be the bond that seals the agreement between families. Brennan rubbed his weathered jaw thoughtfully. I suppose it has worked before in other places and times, and God knows we need something to break this cycle. All right, Thornton, I will help you. But you had better be serious about this, because if you are playing games with that young woman's heart, I will arrest you myself. I am serious, Jackson said firmly. More serious than I have been about anything in my life. Father Miguel was similarly cautious but ultimately supportive. Marriage is a sacred bond, the priest reminded Jackson. It should not be entered into lightly, even for the noblest of reasons. Do you truly believe you can build a life with Eleanor Hayes? Yes, Father, Jackson said without hesitation. I know it began as a practical solution, but something real has grown between us. I care for her deeply, and I believe she feels the same way. Then I will pray for you both, Father Miguel said, and I will do what I can to help bring your families to the negotiating table. But Jackson, you must prepare yourself for resistance. There will be those on both sides who do not want peace, who have invested too much in the conflict to let it go easily. Jackson knew the priest was right. That evening he called a meeting with his brothers and Tom Whitaker to explain his plan. The reaction was even more explosive than he had anticipated. You want to marry Marcus Hayes's daughter, Samuel shouted, jumping to his feet. Have you lost your mind? That man killed our father." "I am aware of that," Jackson said calmly, though his jaw was tight. "But continuing this feud will not bring father back. It will only create more widows and orphans. So your solution is to marry into the family that destroyed ours." Samuel's face was red with anger. "How can you even consider it?" "Because I am tired of death," Jackson said, his voice rising. "Because I am tired of wondering which of you will be next. Because Eleanor Hayes is a good woman who wants peace as much as I do, and together we might be able to build something better than this cycle of revenge." David had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now he spoke. "You care for her, do not you? This is not just about peace." Jackson met his brother's eyes. "No, it is not just about peace. I do care for her, but that does not make the practical reasons any less valid. A marriage alliance could give both families a reason to cooperate rather than fight." "Our men will not like it," Tom warned. "Many of them have lost friends in this feud. They will see it as a betrayal. Then they will have to adjust," Jackson said firmly. "I am not asking for permission. I am telling you what I intend to do. This ranch has been my responsibility since father died, and I am making the decision I think is best for all of us." "And what if the Hayes family attacks us anyway once you have married the daughter?" Samuel demanded. "What if this is all a trap?" "It is not a trap," Jackson said. "Eleanor is sincere. I am certain of it. And if I am wrong, if I am being foolish, then at least I will have tried something other than more killing." The brothers argued late into the night, but eventually, David came around to supporting Jackson's plan, and even Samuel grudgingly agreed to give it a chance. Tom remained skeptical but loyal, promising to back whatever decision Jackson made. Meanwhile, Eleanor was having her own difficult conversations at the Hayes ranch. Her father had aged noticeably in the years since Robert's death, his hair gone mostly gray and new lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. But he still carried himself with the same rigid pride that had fueled the feud for so long. "Father, I need to speak with you about something important," Eleanor said one evening after supper. Her two brothers, Thomas and William, were present as well, both of them eyeing her with curiosity. "What is it, daughter?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. "The feud with the Thorntons," Eleanor began carefully. "It has been going on for 5 years now. 6 men are dead, and there is no end in sight." "The Thorntons will pay for what they did to your brother," Marcus said, his voice hard. "I have sworn it." "And when they have paid, will Robert come back?" Eleanor asked gently. "Father, I miss him too. I think about him every day, but killing more people will not bring him back. It will only create more grieving families." "She has a point," William said unexpectedly. He was 28, the eldest of the Hayes children, and the years of conflict had worn on him. "I am tired of sleeping with a gun under my pillow. Tired of wondering if today is the day someone decides to ambush us." "Are you suggesting we surrender?" Marcus demanded. "That we let the Thorntons humiliate us?" "I am suggesting we find a way to end this that does not involve more bloodshed," Eleanor said. "There are other solutions, Father. Other ways to resolve conflicts." "Such as?" Thomas asked. He was 25, closer to Eleanor in age, and had always been more willing to listen to her than their father was. Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment of truth. "An alliance. A formal peace agreement that gives both families access to the water and grazing lands they need, sealed with a bond that cannot be easily broken." "What kind of bond?" Marcus asked suspiciously. "A marriage," Eleanor said quietly, "between the two families." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at his daughter as though she had spoken in a foreign language. Thomas and William exchanged shocked glances. "You cannot be serious," Marcus finally said. Marry a Thornton, after what they have done to us. I am absolutely serious, Eleanor said, forcing herself to remain calm. Father, this feud has cost us too much already. Do you want to lose Thomas or William too? Do you want to die yourself, knowing you left your children locked in a cycle of violence? Who put this idea in your head? Marcus demanded, his eyes narrowing. Have you been speaking with someone? With one of them? Eleanor hesitated, knowing she could not lie but afraid of how her father would react to the truth. I have spoken with Jackson Thornton. Several times at the church, with Mrs. Cooper present as chaperone. We have discussed the possibility of peace between our families. Marcus's face turned a dangerous shade of red. You have been meeting secretly with the son of the man I killed. How dare you? How dare you betray your family like this? I am not betraying anyone, Eleanor said, her own temper flaring now. I am trying to save this family. Jackson Thornton wants peace as much as I do. He is tired of the killing, tired of the hatred. Together, we think we can end this. Together, Marcus seized on the word. So you have feelings for this man, for a Thornton, Eleanor lifted her chin defiantly. Yes, I do. He is a good man, Father, honorable and brave, and he is willing to risk everything to make peace, even though you killed his father. Get out, Marcus said coldly. Get out of my sight before I say something I regret. Father, please listen, Eleanor began, but Thomas took her arm. Come on, Eleanor, give him time to cool down. Thomas led her out of the room, and Eleanor found herself shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. In the hallway, William joined them, his expression troubled. You have been meeting with Jackson Thornton, William asked. For how long? Several weeks, Eleanor admitted. I know you are angry, but please understand, this is not some foolish romance. We are trying to find a real solution. Do you love him? Thomas asked bluntly. Eleanor considered lying, then decided her brothers deserved the truth. I think I might. I did not expect to, but he is different from what I imagined. He is thoughtful and kind, and he genuinely wants what is best for everyone. William shook his head slowly. This is going to tear the family apart, Eleanor. The feud is already tearing us apart, she replied. This might be our only chance to put the pieces back together. Over the following days, tensions ran high in both households. Jackson met with Sheriff Brennan and Father Miguel to formalize the peace proposal, drafting a document that outlined shared water rights, grazing boundaries, and terms for cooperation. At the heart of the agreement was the marriage between Jackson and Eleanor, described as a binding union between the Thornton and Hayes families, symbolizing the end of hostilities and the beginning of a new era of cooperation. Eleanor worked tirelessly to convince her father to at least consider the proposal. She enlisted the help of family friends, including Dr. Morrison, the town physician who had treated casualties from both sides of the feud and who was respected by everyone. Slowly, reluctantly, Marcus began to soften. I would need to meet this Thornton boy, Marcus finally said one evening. Look him in the eye and see what kind of man he is. I can arrange that, Eleanor said quickly, hardly daring to breathe. Sheriff Brennan and Father Miguel have offered to mediate a meeting. Very well, Marcus said heavily. But I promise nothing, Eleanor. If I think this is a mistake, I will end it, regardless of your feelings. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the sheriff's office, neutral ground where both families could feel safe. Jackson arrived early with his brothers and Tom Whitaker. His stomach was tight with nerves, knowing that everything depended on the next few hours. Eleanor arrived with her father and brothers shortly after. When she entered the room, Jackson's eyes immediately found hers, and he saw his own anxiety reflected in her expression. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. Marcus Hayes was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, with piercing blue eyes that fixed on Jackson with unmistakable hostility. "So you are the boy who wants to marry my daughter?" "Yes, sir," Jackson said, standing and extending his hand. "Jackson Thornton. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Marcus ignored the offered hand, and Jackson let it drop. The older man studied him for a long moment, and Jackson forced himself to meet that hard gaze without flinching. "Why?" Marcus finally asked. "Why would you want to marry into the family that killed your father?" "Because I am tired of death," Jackson said honestly. "Because this feud has taken enough from both of us. And because I believe your daughter and I can build something better than what we inherited." "Pretty words," Marcus said dismissively. "But words are cheap. How do I know this is not some scheme to gain advantage over my family?" "You do not," Jackson admitted. "Just as I have no guarantee that you will honor any agreement we make. But that is where faith comes in, Mr. Hayes. Faith that we are both tired enough of the bloodshed to genuinely want peace." Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should review the terms of the proposal." For the next hour, they went through the document line by line. Marcus challenged nearly every point, but Jackson could see it was more from habit than genuine opposition. The older man was testing him, seeing if he would stand firm or cave under pressure. Jackson held his ground on the essential points while showing flexibility on others, demonstrating both strength and willingness to compromise. Eleanor remained mostly silent during the negotiations, but Jackson was acutely aware of her presence. Several times their eyes met, and he drew strength from the support he saw in her gaze. Finally, Marcus sat back and looked at his daughter. "Eleanor, is this truly what you want? To marry this man and tie yourself to the Thornton family?" "Yes, father," Eleanor said clearly. "It is what I want. Even knowing that many will disapprove, that there will be people on both sides who see this as a betrayal. Even knowing that," Eleanor confirmed. "I believe Jackson and I can make this work, and I believe this is the best chance we have to end the violence." Marcus turned to Jackson. "And you, Thornton, are you prepared to take my daughter as your wife, to honor and protect her even when the road is difficult?" "I am," Jackson said without hesitation. "I give you my word, sir. I will spend my life trying to make her happy." "Your word," Marcus repeated bitterly. "The word of a Thornton. Forgive me if I find that hard to trust." "Then trust me, father," Eleanor said quietly. "Trust that I would not agree to this if I did not believe Jackson was sincere." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a crack in the hard facade. He looked at his daughter, and Jackson saw genuine love beneath the anger and pride. "You are all I have left of your mother," Marcus said roughly. "I cannot lose you too." "You will not lose me," Eleanor promised. "This marriage will bring our families together, father. You will gain a son, not lose a daughter." The silence stretched out, tension thick in the air. Then, slowly, Marcus nodded. "Very well, I agree to the proposal. But hear me, Thornton. If you harm my daughter in any way, if you break her heart or treat her poorly, peace agreement or not, I will kill you myself." "Understood," Jackson said. "But you need not worry, sir. I will treasure her." The wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving both families time to adjust to the idea and make preparations. Father Miguel would perform the ceremony at the church, with Sheriff Brennan serving as official witness to both the marriage and the peace agreement. Those 3 weeks were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Jackson and Eleanor were allowed to spend time together, though always under supervision, to prepare for their upcoming life as husband and wife. They walked through Presidio, discussing their hopes and plans, gradually becoming more comfortable with the idea that they would soon be married. "Are you nervous?" Eleanor asked one afternoon as they sat by the Rio Grande, watching the sluggish current flow past. "Terrified," Jackson admitted with a slight laugh. Not of marrying you, he added quickly, but of failing, of not being able to deliver on this promise of peace. We will do it together, Eleanor said, reaching over to take his hand. The gesture had become natural between them over the past weeks, a physical manifestation of the growing bond. Neither of us has to carry this burden alone. Jackson looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. Do you ever regret agreeing to this? Wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed in San Antonio, married someone else? Never, Eleanor said firmly. This feels right, Jackson. Difficult, yes. Complicated, certainly. But right. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. I am falling in love with you, Eleanor Hayes. I thought you should know that before we wed. Eleanor's eyes shimmered with emotion. I am falling in love with you too. In fact, I think I started falling the first moment I saw you outside the dress shop before I even knew who you were. When you smiled at me, Jackson remembered, before names and history complicated everything. Perhaps that was fate telling us that we were meant for this, Eleanor suggested. That we could see each other clearly without the prejudice of the feud clouding our vision. The wedding day dawned clear and hot, the sun already baking the earth by the time preparations began. Eleanor dressed at her father's ranch, helped by Mrs. Cooper and several other women from town. Her dress was simple but elegant, white cotton with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves, practical for the Texas heat but still befitting the solemnity of the occasion. You look beautiful, child, Mrs. Cooper said, tears in her eyes. Your mother would have been so proud. Eleanor thought about the mother she had lost 5 years earlier, wishing desperately that she could be here for this moment. But perhaps her mother was watching somehow, pleased that her daughter was helping to heal the rift that had torn their community apart. At the church, Jackson waited with his brothers, wearing his best suit and trying to calm his racing heart. The small building was packed with people from both families and from the wider Presidio community, all of them curious to witness this historic union. When Eleanor entered on her father's arm, Jackson felt his breath catch. She was radiant, her dark hair arranged in soft curls around her face, her green eyes bright with emotion. As she walked down the short aisle toward him, their eyes locked, and Jackson saw his own feelings reflected in her gaze. Hope, nervousness, love, and determination. Marcus Hayes placed Eleanor's hand in Jackson's, a gesture heavy with symbolism. Take care of her, the older man said gruffly. I will, Jackson promised. You have my word. Father Miguel began the ceremony, his voice rich with feeling as he spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the power of reconciliation. Today we witness not just the union of two people, but the healing of two families, the priest said. Jackson and Eleanor have chosen a difficult path, but it is a path of courage and hope. May God bless their union and grant them the strength to build a future worthy of the sacrifices that brought them here. Jackson and Eleanor exchanged vows, their voices steady despite the emotion of the moment. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson leaned in to kiss Eleanor gently, sealing their commitment before God and their community. The gathering afterward was awkward at first, members of the two families uncertain how to interact after years of hostility. But gradually, cautiously, conversations began. Thomas Hayes found himself talking cattle with David Thornton and discovered they had similar ideas about breeding strategies. Tom Whitaker shared a drink with Marcus Hayes, both men acknowledging the relief of not having to sleep with guns under their pillows anymore. Jackson and Eleanor moved through the crowd together, their joined hands a visible symbol of the new alliance. They spoke with everyone, thanking them for coming, acknowledging the difficulty of the transition, but emphasizing their hope for the future. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jackson and Eleanor prepared to leave for the Thornton ranch, which would be their home. Eleanor had said goodbye to her father earlier, a tearful but hopeful parting. "Remember what I told you," Marcus had said, gripping his daughter's hands. "If he mistreats you in any way, you come home immediately." "He will not," Eleanor had assured him. "But thank you, Father, for trusting me, for giving peace a chance." The Thornton ranch house had been prepared for Eleanor's arrival, the main bedroom cleaned and furnished with pieces brought from the Hayes ranch to make her feel more at home. When they finally arrived, after the long day of ceremony and celebration, Jackson carried Eleanor over the threshold in the traditional gesture of a groom bringing his bride home. Inside, away from the eyes of family and community, they finally had a moment of privacy. Jackson set Eleanor down gently, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. They were married now, legally and in the eyes of God, but the reality of sharing a life, a home, a bed was still new and somewhat daunting. "Are you tired?" Jackson asked. "It has been a long day." "Exhausted," Eleanor admitted. "But happy." "Are you?" "Very happy," Jackson said. He reached up to cup her face gently, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Eleanor Thornton, it sounds right." "It does," she agreed, leaning into his touch. "Jackson, I know this marriage began as a practical arrangement, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are genuine. I did not expect to fall in love with you, but I have." "I love you too," Jackson said. "More than I thought possible in such a short time. And I promise you, Eleanor, I will spend the rest of my life proving that this decision was the right one." He kissed her then, deeper than the chaste kiss they had shared at the church, and Eleanor responded with equal passion. Whatever uncertainties still lay ahead, whatever challenges they would face in merging their families and building a life together, in that moment they were simply a man and woman in love, beginning their journey together. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Eleanor had to learn the rhythms of the Thornton ranch, getting to know the men who worked for Jackson and establishing her place in the household. Some of the hands were skeptical at first, unsure about having a Hayes living among them, but Eleanor's natural warmth and genuine interest in their lives gradually won them over. Jackson, meanwhile, had to learn to share his life and his decisions with another person. He had been alone for so long, shouldering the burden of the ranch and the feud by himself, that it took time to adjust to having a partner. But Eleanor proved to be not just a supportive wife but a valuable advisor, bringing fresh perspectives to problems and helping him see solutions he might have missed. The peace between the families held, though it was fragile at first. There were incidents, moments when old hatreds threatened to resurface. A Thornton hand got into a fight with a Hayes worker at the saloon, and Jackson and Marcus had to intervene before violence erupted. Boundary disputes arose, testing the new agreement. But Jackson and Eleanor worked tirelessly to maintain the peace, serving as bridges between the families. When conflicts arose, they brought the parties together to talk rather than fight. Slowly, grudgingly, cooperation replaced hostility. 6 months after the wedding, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news filled both families with joy and gave everyone something positive to focus on. Marcus Hayes was particularly thrilled at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, and his relationship with Jackson warmed considerably. "A grandchild," Marcus said wonderingly when Eleanor told him. "A child who will carry both Thornton and Hayes blood. Perhaps that is the true seal of peace, not just the marriage but the next generation." "I hope so, Father," Eleanor said. "I hope this child grows up in a world where the feud is just a story from the past, not a present danger." The pregnancy was not easy. The Texas heat was brutal that summer, and Eleanor struggled with nausea and exhaustion. Jackson was attentive and worried, hovering over her until she finally had to tell him to give her some space to breathe. "I am not made of glass," Eleanor said with exasperation one afternoon, when Jackson had insisted she rest rather than help with the garden she had been planting. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "But they have not all been my wife having my baby," Jackson retorted. "Let me worry about you, it makes me feel useful." Eleanor softened, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. "I know you are worried, but I am strong, Jackson. I will be fine, and so will our child." In February of 1884, during a rare cold snap that brought snow to the Texas desert, Eleanor went into labor. Dr. Morrison was summoned, along with Mrs. Cooper and several other experienced women to assist. Jackson paced outside the bedroom, his brothers trying unsuccessfully to calm him. "She is going to be fine," David said for the 100th time. "Dr. Morrison is the best." "Childbirth is dangerous," Jackson said tightly. "Women die. I cannot lose her, David, I cannot." "You will not," David assured him. "Eleanor is strong. She has survived worse than this." The labor lasted through the night and into the morning. Jackson heard Eleanor cry out several times, and each sound felt like a knife to his heart. He wanted to go to her to hold her hand and comfort her, but the women had barred him from the room, insisting he would only be in the way. Finally, as the sun rose over the desert, Jackson heard a new sound, the wail of an infant. He was on his feet immediately, his heart pounding. Mrs. Cooper emerged a few minutes later, beaming. "You have a son, Mr. Thornton, a healthy boy, and your wife is well, though tired." Jackson sagged with relief, then rushed past Mrs. Cooper into the bedroom. Eleanor was propped up against pillows, her face pale and damp with sweat but her eyes shining with joy. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in blankets. "Jackson," she said softly, "come meet your son." Jackson approached the bed as though in a dream. Eleanor pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny red face, eyes scrunched shut, one small fist waving in the air. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and even at just hours old, Jackson could see traces of both families in his features. "He is perfect," Jackson breathed, reaching out to touch his son's impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his, and Jackson felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Robert," Eleanor said quietly, "after my brother." "Would that be all right?" Jackson looked at his wife, seeing the hope and vulnerability in her eyes. "Robert Thornton," he said, testing the name. "I think it is perfect. A bridge between the families, just like he will be." Word spread quickly through both families, and soon the Thornton ranch was crowded with visitors wanting to see the baby. Marcus Hayes arrived with tears in his eyes, holding his grandson with a tenderness that surprised everyone. "He has your mother's eyes," Marcus told Eleanor. She would have loved to meet him. Thomas and William were equally enchanted by their nephew, and even Samuel, who had been most resistant to the marriage, softened when he held the baby. "I suppose if any good can come from this situation, a healthy child is it," Samuel admitted grudgingly. "The feud is over, Samuel," Jackson said firmly. "This child deserves to grow up in peace, not surrounded by hatred. We all need to let go of the past." As the months passed and Robert grew from a newborn into a healthy, active baby, the peace between the families solidified into something deeper. Genuine cooperation and, eventually, affection. The shared water rights worked better than anyone had expected, and the combined resources of both ranches allowed them to weather a drought that devastated other area ranchers. Jackson and Eleanor's love deepened as well, maturing from the intense passion of newlyweds into something more profound. They learned each other's rhythms, supported each other through difficulties, and celebrated successes together. Eleanor proved to be not just a loving wife, but a capable ranch partner, taking on responsibilities for managing the household finances and supervising some of the ranch operations. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Eleanor told Jackson one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while Robert napped inside. "When I came back from San Antonio, I was so afraid of what I would find. The violence, the hatred, and now look at us." "It almost did not happen," Jackson reflected. "If you had not been brave enough to talk to me that day outside the dress shop, if I had not been willing to consider an alternative to revenge, we came so close to missing this." "But we did not miss it," Eleanor said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We chose differently. We chose peace and love over hatred, and now we have Robert and both our families working together. It was worth every difficult moment." 2 years later, Eleanor gave birth again, this time to a daughter they named Sarah, after Jackson's mother. Marcus Hayes doted on both grandchildren, and Jackson was amused to see how thoroughly the old man had softened. The Marcus Hayes who had once thirsted for Thornton blood was now a loving grandfather who spent hours playing with the children and teaching Robert to ride. "Fatherhood suits you," Tom Whitaker told Jackson one afternoon, as they watched Jackson play with his children in the yard. "And I must say, I never thought I would see the day when Marcus Hayes would be welcome on this ranch, let alone a regular visitor." "Neither did I," Jackson admitted. "But that is what happens when you give peace a chance. People can surprise you. They can change and grow if they are given the opportunity." David Thornton married one of the Hayes family's neighbors the following year, and the wedding was attended by both families without incident. Samuel eventually married as well and settled on a portion of the Thornton ranch, building his own home and starting his own family. Thomas and William Hayes both married, and their children grew up playing with their Thornton cousins. The old feud nothing more than a story their parents occasionally told. 5 years after their wedding, Jackson and Eleanor stood in the Presidio cemetery on a cool November afternoon. They were visiting the graves of those who had died in the feud, something they did every year on their anniversary. 6 men, Eleanor said quietly, reading the names on the headstones. 6 men who died for nothing, for pride and stubbornness and the inability to see past old grievances. "Not for nothing," Jackson corrected gently. "Their deaths taught us the cost of hatred. They showed us what happens when we let anger and revenge control us. In a way, they made our marriage possible, made the peace possible, because no one wanted any more graves." "I suppose that is true," Eleanor said, "but I still wish they had not had to die. I wish we had found another way." "So do I," Jackson agreed. He put his arm around his wife, drawing her close. "But we cannot change the past. All we can do is make sure their deaths were not in vain by building a better future." They stood together in silence for a few more minutes, paying their respects, then walked back toward town hand in hand. Robert and Sarah were waiting with Mrs. Cooper, and the children ran to greet their parents with shouts of joy. Jackson lifted Sarah into his arms while Robert grabbed Eleanor's hand, chattering excitedly about the candy Mrs. Cooper had bought them. As they walked together through the streets of Presidio, Jackson thought about how far they had all come. The town that had once been divided by violence and hatred was now a thriving community where Thorntons and Hayes worked and lived together in harmony. That evening, after the children were asleep, Jackson and Eleanor sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the soft murmur of the Rio Grande. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked. "Marrying me, leaving your father's house, taking on all these responsibilities?" Eleanor turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside the house. "Never. Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Jackson Thornton. You and our children and the life we have built together. This is exactly where I am meant to be." Jackson pulled her close, kissing her with all the love and gratitude he felt. "I love you, Eleanor, today, tomorrow, and for all the days we have left." "And I love you," Eleanor replied. "Always and forever." 10 years after their wedding in the spring of 1894, both families gathered at the Thornton Ranch for a celebration. It was Robert's 10th birthday, but it was also the anniversary of the peace agreement that had changed all their lives. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by women from both families. Children ran and played, their laughter filling the air. Men from both ranches talked and joked, old enmities forgotten. Jackson stood on the porch, surveying the scene with deep satisfaction. His family had grown to include 3 more children after Sarah, twin boys named James and Matthew, and a younger daughter, Elizabeth. Eleanor was pregnant again, expecting their 6th child in the fall. Marcus Hayes, now in his 60s and showing his age but still spry, walked up to join Jackson on the porch. "Quite a gathering," the older man observed. "It is," Jackson agreed. "Hard to believe that 12 years ago we were trying to kill each other. And now our families are so intertwined I can barely keep track of who is related to whom," Marcus said with a chuckle. "My grandchildren, your children, nieces and nephews all over the place. It is a good problem to have." "The best kind," Jackson said. He paused, then added, "Thank you, Marcus, for giving peace a chance, for trusting Eleanor and me to make this work." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I should be thanking you. You saved my family, Jackson. If the feud had continued, I would probably be dead by now and my sons with me. Instead, I am here, watching my grandchildren grow up happy and safe. That is worth more than all the pride and revenge in the world." The 2 men shook hands, a gesture that symbolized everything they had overcome and everything they had built together. Eleanor appeared, carrying Elizabeth on her hip. "Robert is asking for his birthday cake," she told them, smiling, "and I think everyone is ready to eat." Jackson took Elizabeth from her, giving Eleanor a break. The little girl, only 2 years old, wrapped her arms around his neck and planted a wet kiss on his cheek. "Papa," she said happily. "That is right, sweetheart," Jackson said. "Let us go get your brother his cake." The celebration continued late into the evening, with music and dancing after the meal. Jackson danced with Eleanor, holding her close despite her protruding belly, marveling at how beautiful she still was to him after 10 years of marriage. "Happy," he murmured in her ear. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Eleanor replied. "When I think about how different our lives could have been, how close we came to missing all of this, it makes me grateful for every single day." "We made the right choice," Jackson said, "choosing love over hatred, peace over revenge. It was not easy, but it was right." "The best choice," Eleanor agreed, resting her head against his shoulder as they swayed to the music. "The best choice we ever made." As the stars came out over the Texas desert and the music played on, Jackson looked around at the gathered families, at the children playing and the adults laughing, at the life he and Eleanor had built from the ashes of a deadly feud. 6 men had died to teach them the cost of hatred, but from that tragedy had come something beautiful. A family united, a community healed, and a love that had proved stronger than violence. The years continued to pass peacefully. Jackson and Eleanor's 6th child was born in October, another son they named Daniel. The Thornton and Hayes ranches continued to prosper, their cooperation giving them advantages over other ranchers in the region. They expanded their operations, buying additional land and increasing their herds. Robert grew into a fine young man, learning the ranching business from both his father and his grandfather. He had inherited the best qualities of both families, the Thornton determination and the Hayes shrewdness. Sarah became a beautiful young woman who loved books and learning, much like her mother. In 1898, when they had been married for 15 years, Eleanor and Jackson took a trip to San Antonio, leaving the older children in charge of their younger siblings. It was the first time they had been alone together since their honeymoon, and the second honeymoon was a gift to themselves. Walking through the streets of San Antonio, Eleanor pointed out the convent school where she had spent 4 years. "I was so lonely here," she confessed. "I missed my family, missed home, but I also knew my father was trying to protect me from the violence. I just never imagined that when I returned, I would end up marrying a Thornton." "Fate has a strange sense of humor," Jackson said. "If someone had told me when I rode into Presidio that day that I would marry Marcus Hayes's daughter, I would have said they were insane." "And yet here we are," Eleanor said, linking her arm through his. 15 years later, with 6 children and more happiness than either of us knew what to do with. They stayed in San Antonio for a week, enjoying the luxury of sleeping late, taking leisurely meals, and exploring the city together. But by the end of the week, they were both eager to return home to their children and their ranch. "As wonderful as this has been, I miss them," Eleanor admitted on the train ride home. "I miss Robert's serious face when he is trying to figure something out, and Sarah's laughter, and the way the twins always get into mischief together. I even miss Elizabeth's sticky kisses and Daniel's crying at night. We are blessed," Jackson said simply, "blessed beyond measure." When they arrived back at the ranch, they were greeted by a scene of chaos. The twins had somehow managed to let all the chickens out of the coop, and Sarah and Robert were chasing them around the yard while Elizabeth and Daniel sat on the porch steps, laughing at the spectacle. "Welcome home," Tom Whitaker said dryly from his position on the porch. "They have been angels, as you can see." Eleanor laughed, the sound pure and joyful. "It is good to be home." Jackson gathered as many of his children as he could into his arms, feeling their warmth and energy, smelling the familiar sense of home and family. This was what they had fought for, what they had risked everything to achieve. Not just peace between warring families, but this: love, laughter, life in all its messy, beautiful glory. Marcus Hayes passed away in the winter of 1902, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68. The entire community turned out for his funeral, testament to how much the old rancher had changed in his later years. Jackson served as one of the pallbearers, alongside Marcus's sons and other members of the Hayes family. "He became a good man in the end," Tom Whitaker said at the wake. "Better than many of us expected." "He always was a good man," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes red from crying. "He just let grief and anger consume him for a while, but underneath, the man my mother fell in love with was still there. Jackson and Robert helped him find that man again." "Your father gave us a gift when he agreed to the peace," Jackson told her, holding her close. "He was brave enough to set aside his pride and think about the future. Not many men could have done that." In his will, Marcus had divided his ranch equally among his children, with the stipulation that Eleanor and her brothers continue to work together. Thomas and William honored their father's wishes, and the cooperation between the Thornton and Hayes ranches continued seamlessly. Robert Thornton was 18 now, grown into a man who resembled his father but had his own quiet strength. He had been named after Eleanor's brother who died in the feud, and he took that legacy seriously, seeing himself as a living symbol of peace between the families. "I want to expand the ranch," Robert told his parents one evening. I have been studying new techniques for water conservation and cattle breeding. I think we could double our productivity within 5 years if we implement some of these methods." "Tell me more," Jackson said, pleased by his son's initiative. As Robert explained his ideas, Jackson caught Eleanor's eye and saw his own pride reflected there. Their children had grown up without the shadow of violence hanging over them. They were free to dream and plan, to build rather than destroy. That was worth more than all the cattle in Texas. Sarah married in 1904, a young lawyer from El Paso named Thomas Reynolds. The wedding was a joyous affair, and Eleanor cried happy tears as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle. "Our first child to marry," Eleanor whispered to Jackson. "Where did the time go?" "Into building a life," Jackson replied. "Into raising a family, into making sure the peace held. It was time well spent." The twins, James and Matthew, followed Robert into the ranching business, while Elizabeth showed an interest in teaching, inspired by her mother's love of education. Daniel, the youngest, was still finding his way, but at 12 years old he had time to figure out what he wanted. In 1908, 25 years after their wedding, Jackson and Eleanor stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They were both in their 50s now, their hair showing silver threads, their faces lined with the years. But their love had only deepened with time. 25 years, Eleanor marveled. A quarter of a century since we took that leap of faith. "Best decision I ever made," Jackson said, putting his arm around her waist. "You have made every day of those 25 years worthwhile, Eleanor. And you have given me a life beyond anything I imagined," Eleanor replied. "Not just the children and the ranch, but the knowledge that we made a difference. We changed the course of our family's history, Jackson. We broke the cycle of violence and created something better." "We did it together," Jackson said. "That was the key. Not me, not you, but us together." Robert approached from the barn, now a confident man of 24, engaged to be married himself to a young woman from a neighboring ranch. "Mother, father, supper is almost ready. Grandmother sent word that everyone is gathering." They had started a tradition years ago of having Sunday suppers together, rotating between the various family homes. Tonight it was the Thornton ranch's turn, and Eleanor had been cooking all day with help from her daughters and daughters-in-law. The house was soon filled with family. Robert and his fiancée, Sarah and her husband with their 2 young children, the twins and their respective girlfriends, Elizabeth home from her teaching post in town, and Daniel. Thomas and William Hayes came with their families as well, along with Jackson's brothers and their children. The table stretched the length of the main room, crowded with 3 generations of Thorntons and Hayes. As Jackson looked around at the gathered family, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The hatred that had once threatened to destroy both families had been transformed into this: love, connection, a shared future. 6 men had died in the feud, and their deaths had not been meaningless. Those deaths had taught them all the terrible cost of violence and the preciousness of peace. "I would like to propose a toast," Jackson said, standing with his glass raised. The room quieted. "To family. To the families we were born into and the families we have chosen. To the memory of those we have lost, and to the hope of future generations. And especially to my wife, Eleanor, who had the courage 25 years ago to imagine that love could be stronger than hatred. To Eleanor," the room chorused, glasses raised. Eleanor blushed, but her eyes were bright with happy tears. "And to Jackson," she added, "who was brave enough to meet me halfway, to risk everything for the possibility of peace. I love you, my dear husband, today, tomorrow, and always." They kissed, to the applause and good-natured teasing of their assembled family. And as the evening wore on, filled with laughter and stories and the warmth of family love, Jackson and Eleanor knew that they had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The feud that had killed 6 men was now just a story told to warn against the dangers of pride and revenge. In its place had grown something infinitely more valuable: a family united, a community healed, and a love that had proved strong enough to bridge any divide. Years later, when Jackson and Eleanor were in their 60s, they would sit on that same porch and watch their grandchildren play in the yard where once men had faced each other with guns drawn. They would hold hands and remember the day they met, the choice they made, the life they built together. "No regrets?" Jackson would ask, as he had asked so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Eleanor would always reply. "Only gratitude for every day we have had together." And when they finally passed, first Jackson in 1920 at the age of 63, and then Eleanor 2 years later at 62, they were buried side by side in the Presidio cemetery. Their headstone bore a simple inscription: "Here lie Jackson and Eleanor Thornton, who chose love over hatred and gave us peace." The legacy they left behind was more than just a prosperous ranch or a large family. It was the knowledge that even the deepest hatreds can be healed, that love is stronger than violence, and that one brave choice can change the course of history. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would carry that legacy forward, remembering always that they owed their very existence to the courage of 2 people who dared to dream of peace in a time of war. The feud had killed 6 men, but the marriage that ended it gave life to generations. And in the end, that was the truest victory: not just the absence of violence, but the presence of love, abundant and enduring, transforming everything it touched.